Hello and welcome to Research and Teaching about Equity Compensation, Employee Share Ownership, and Profit Sharing in Organizations. This is a professional development workshop for the 2020 Academy of Management virtual annual meeting. I'm Adria Scharf. I am Beister Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. And I am also Director of the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership, which is a large online library of teaching materials about employee ownership found at cleo.rutgers.edu. And this curriculum library houses hundreds and hundreds of resources for business school professors and professors in related fields who want to explore how to teach about employee share ownership in their regular college and university courses. It is a free resource and we very much invite you to make use of it. Now, I want to introduce my three colleagues who we're so fortunate to have with us today. Joseph Blasi is J. Robert Beister Distinguished Professor and Director of the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. Daphne Berry is Associate Professor of Management, Marketing, and Entrepreneurship at the Barney School of Business at University of Hartford, and Robert W. Edwards Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. And Ed Carberry is Associate Professor of Management at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Blue Wolf Capital Fellow and Beister Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, again at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. We will start now with Joseph Blasi, who will open with some definitions and a brief summary of research highlights. So Joseph, what do we mean when we talk about employee share ownership, and what does the research tell us? Joseph, unmute yourself.
I'm delighted to be with you today, and sorry that we're not in Vancouver all together. So I'm joined by colleagues from different universities, all of whom are fellows of the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing here at Rutgers. The Institute was set up over the last 15 years to be a collaborative home for this scholarship with over 150 fellows. We offer 10 to 20 competitive research fellowships granted annually with significant financial support, 2 academic conferences each year for the research fellows, the housing of empirical data sets, both administrative from the government and private data sets. We launch collaborative research projects like the work on profit and equity shares in the General Social Survey, the National Bureau for Economic Research Shared Capitalism Project, and our recent Kellogg Rutgers University project on racial wealth gap and shares. And we do policy analysis. And today we're focusing on teaching about employee shares and trying to emphasize the work that Dr. Adria Scharf, the head of the Curriculum Library on Employee Ownership, is doing. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes right now just to kind of introduce the topic. A little bit of definition of terms. So we often think that typically business hires or rents labor for a wage, and that's kind of it. But what do we call it when employees own or hire capital in a private market system? There are many terms in history over the last 100 years. Actually, in the 1800s, this was called cooperation, which referred to profit sharing and equity participation. Then it was called industrial co-partnership, common in Europe, then profit sharing, industrial co-partnership and cooperative production by John Stuart Mill, who was really responsible when he wrote his major work on political and social theory for introducing the study of these issues into the United States. And then welfare capitalism, referring to the experience of Kodak and Procter & Gamble and such firms in the 20s. Employee stock ownership by the Rockefeller Group, who experimented with the series of employee share ownership plans at different companies, and then worker co-ops. The current nomenclature is to talk about employee stock ownership plans, employee stock purchase plans, profit sharing, equity compensation, employee ownership trusts, and worker co-ops. And I'll briefly explain what they are, very briefly. So how much of this is there? About 25 years ago, working with the National Opinion Research Council at the University of Chicago, we added questions to the General Social Survey on this. So we have really good national representative sample data. The 2018 General Social Survey indicates that a fifth of workers report they own equity shares. A third have profit or gain shares. About a tenth have stock options in their company. And surprise, 50.2% of all adult private sector workers report they have some combination of all of these. It's kind of interesting because for years, scholars in this area have been hearing, if this was so interesting, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, 0.2% over half of everybody appears to be doing it. So briefly, in terms of employee share ownership, it averages about 1 to 3% in the 3,300 stock market companies. In the 6,000 closely held ESOP companies, there's a few thousand that are 100% or majority employee owned, and many that are 20 or 30% employee owned, many hundreds. And then there are about 400 worker co-ops in the United States, and there are modest layers of equity compensation in many high-tech firms and many other public companies. So just to briefly define the management practices here, excuse me. So profit sharing typically is cash profit sharing, or could be deferred profit sharing under an ERISA retirement plan. This is the plan that was common in Sears in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Or it could be gain sharing. Gain sharing is where employees receive a percentage of the gain, percentage of sales, percentage of some gain of a work group, not the entire company. Gain sharing, oftentimes referred to the Scanlon Plan, which was designed by people from the United Steelworkers of America Union, is also very popular. Employee stock ownership plans have become extremely popular since the 1950s. Just a little history here. The Rockefeller Group really pushed workers buying shares in the 20s. And when the Great Depression hit and the stock market crashed, that was not very popular again. Louis Kelso came along, a professor of law at the University of Colorado and an investment banker and lawyer. And he said he wanted to design a form of employee equity ownership that did not, NOT, involve the employees buying shares with their savings. So he came up with the employee stock ownership plan, the ESOP, which essentially is a situation where the workers and managers do a leveraged buyout. In other words, they use credit to buy a company, and then the credit is paid back out of the earnings of the company that they buy. It's the same way that a real estate developer buys an apartment building. Borrow money, buy the building, and make sure that the rents of the building match up with the principal payments on the loan to pay back the loan. Then you own 100%. So ESOPs, after they were invented by Kelso and then put into federal law in 1974 in ERISA, allow workers in one transaction or multiple transactions to buy 100% of a firm if they can match the revenue and profits that come out of the firm with the principal payments on the loan to get the credit to buy the firm. Just to be clear, most ESOPs involve zero worker purchases. And the next type is the employee stock purchase plan, which is very common in public companies where under federal law, employees receive a 10 to 50% discount on the shares that they buy. Then there are equity compensation plans, such as broad-based employee stock options, and now very popular restricted stock units. Restricted because that means the employees are restricted to stay with the company for a certain number of years, typically 3 to 5 years, until they vest in the stock. And something called performance shares, where the vesting in the shares relates to company performance. Then we have worker cooperatives based on one worker, one vote, and a considerable degree of company democracy, and employee ownership trusts. I do want to pause for a moment and correct one very, very common misconception about ESOPs and employee stock purchase plans. Employee stock purchase plans, when they appear in stock market companies, have full voting rights on the shares. So you could have a stock market company where the employees own 10% and vote on board elections. Employee stock ownership plans in stock market companies have full voting rights on all governance votes in shareholder meetings. Employee stock ownership plans in closely held companies have a default. They default to voting rights on shares for employees in major corporate issues such as bankruptcy, recapitalization, closing the firm, and things like that. It's very common for management scholars to say that ESOPs have no voting rights. It's just absolutely false. Now, how did management research evolve in the area of equity and profit shares? Let me just go through this in a minute, and then I'll stop my brief introduction. I've done a recent review of scholarship in major journals, really over the last 100 years. So the 1800s focused on profit sharing, worker cooperatives, and employee stock plans, such as those in Procter & Gamble, usually developed by visionary company founders. The 1900s focused more on employee stock plans, which were developed using the Rockefeller Plan, something coming out of a group called the Special Conference Committee, and a number of associations of labor and management in the 20s who tried to redesign the capital system. But there was a huge interruption with the Great Depression, the stock market crash, World War I, and World War II. Then FDR and the Republicans developed profit-sharing tax incentives. And there was an explosion of profit sharing among both the union and non-union firms, and a lot of social science and management research on these. Equity then went out of favor, but the federal government designed the employee stock purchase plan, and we have a good deal of research in the 60s and 70s coming forward on the employee stock purchase plan and the ESOP. The management literature, especially Academy Management Review and Academy of Management Journal, was fascinated with worker buyouts of failing firms or firms spun off in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the media was also equally fascinated. This dominated the management literature. This was actually a very, very small part of this phenomenon. And in some way, it's unfortunate that worker buyouts dominated the management literature. In the 2000s and the late 90s, we have a lot more balance in scholarship. There's a lot of study of closely held employee share ownership and private sharing and gain sharing cases, and also in publicly traded firms, a lot of focus on practices or theory or empirics. With that, I'll end my introduction and sit by and listen to my next colleague. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joseph Blasi. So we on this, all of us involved in this workshop, we believe that it is important to teach about these concepts, to teach about the idea of employee share ownership and its possibility in business school courses, you know, both at the undergraduate and the graduate levels, given the pervasiveness of this phenomenon. As Joseph just shared, something like 1/5 of US employees say that they own stock in the companies where they work. Given its impact, both at the employee level and the firm level and societally. And also I would add, given the promise that employee share ownership represents as a mechanism that can share the benefits of growth more broadly among employees. It represents a very important feature of the modern workplace. And we would argue an under-taught feature in some of our curricula. So we are very fortunate to have with us these three professors, scholars, who already teach in a variety of ways about employee share ownership, equity sharing, in their own courses, each from their own disciplinary perspective, each approaching these questions in different ways. And next in this workshop, Ed Carberry, Daphne Berry, and then Joseph Blasi will each in turn share with us how they individually teach about employee share ownership in their courses and what resources they use. First, Ed Carberry.
Okay, thanks very much, Adria, and welcome everybody out there who is joining us. Greetings from Boston. My name is Ed Carberry. I am Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I am a sociologist by training, so that's how I approach this topic. And employee ownership is one of my primary areas of research, but I also here we go. I also bring it into my teaching. And so what I want to do in this short presentation is talk about how I bring the topic of employee ownership into two of my MBA courses. And so the two courses are, they're both required courses in our MBA curriculum here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. They're pretty much core courses in most MBA curriculums, so I'm hoping this is broadly applicable to those of you out there interested in incorporating employee ownership in some way, shape, or form into your classes. So one class is on business and society. This class is called Business and Its Environment. The second class is more of an OB class called Organizational Analysis and Skills. And just a couple of things, set up to set this up. I mean, what I have found, this is the topic that I've been working on for the last 25 years. But employee ownership connects to a broad range of core topics within these broad subject areas. So in terms of business and society, it connects to issues around corporate governance. In terms of employees as stakeholders, in terms of organizational behavior, we can think about motivation, incentives, empowerment, teamwork, as well as organizational change and organizational culture. So it really touches upon all these issues, and it's a way to sort of nicely illustrate some sort of cutting edge sort of things going on in terms of the management field. And what I've also found is that students have a fairly high level of interest in this topic. So they are often unaware of the prevalence and possibilities of employee ownership. There's still a fundamental lack of knowledge about employee ownership and what it is. And then I find that they're very interested, and they're also very interested because it usually connects, especially my younger students, say in their 20s, it really connects to their values about economic and social justice. So that's sort of sort of set it up. But let's get into one of my courses. This is called Business and Its Environment, and so this is a class on business and society. It's a required course for all of our MBA students, and so this class is divided into two parts. So part one, I have students take the perspective as citizens and stakeholders in a capitalist economy. So we talk about the big issues around corporate social responsibility, ethics, corporate governance, government regulation of business, and corporate influence over public policy. And then in the second part of the course, we approach it more from them as managers, as organizational leaders. And so we talk about stakeholder analysis, stakeholder engagement, crisis management, talk about climate change, sustainability, as well as social movement activism. And so then this is an ever-changing sort of list of topics, but around this core issue around stakeholders and corporate governance. And so that's where, so sort of one of the class sessions I focus on in this class is focusing on employees as stakeholders. And so I use a chapter from a textbook by John Budd called Labor Relations, and all of my references are at the end of this presentation, which will be uploaded, and you can sort of reference that. But he puts out 4 approaches to the employment relationship, which range from kind of sort of mainstream sort of neoliberal economics view of the employment relationship all the way to more critical industrial relations views. And so I have students apply these 4 approaches to the case of Amazon to sort of start us off. And Amazon is a fairly clear example of pretty poor working conditions for most employees. And this is not just their warehouse workers and delivery drivers, which are fairly well-known cases, but also their white-collar professionals in their sort of Seattle HQ. We find pretty poor working conditions. So I have students try to apply these 4 different theoretical approaches to better understand the employment relationship at companies like Amazon, which are really moving on sort of the low-road HR strategy. And then I pose employee ownership as an alternative to the Amazon model. right? And so thinking about here as employees as a key stakeholder at the same level as investors of capital and managers. So I try to put it at that level, and this really challenges students because they don't normally think of employees as key stakeholders at the same level as, say, investors. And so we really try to bring that into the discussion. And so how I set this up is I provide an overview of the most common forms that Joseph just kind of reviewed. And these are some of the sources that I use to have students read. And again, these references are at the end of the slides. And then I go into 3 examples in more depth of actual companies. So New Belgium Brewing, which was an ESOP, was recently sold. It was sold last year, but it's still a really interesting example of an ESOP combining that with a lot of supportive HR practices. Namaste Solar, which is a worker cooperative out in Colorado, and then DPR Construction, which is a construction firm based in California, and they use broad-based phantom stock. So 3 different forms of employee ownership and 3 very different kind of examples. And so the primary source I use for these is a great documentary film called We the Owners, and it provides a lot of in-depth interviews with different sort of scholars and thinkers in the field of employee ownership, but more importantly with employees and managers at these 3 companies talking about their experience. And that's a really effective tool for students to watch on their own before class, or I'll show some of the clips in class. And I also supplement, these cases with information from their websites, from the media to kind of flesh out the cases for them. And then I sort of, open it up for a discussion for the students and I ask them, would you want to work for any of these companies? Why or why not? And that usually opens up a lot of interesting discussions. And what I find is that students are mostly fairly positive about these companies, although there's always a few students who think they seem like a cult. And it's a really interesting discussion that we have about whether they want to work for one of these companies and what it would be like. And then I talk about some of the research, and here are a couple of sources. There are many sources out there that review the research. These are a couple that I use that sort of do provide very quick overviews of the research on the effect of employee ownership on employees and company outcomes. And I try not to get too academic with the research. And then a nice review of a recent study funded by the Kellogg Foundation about the effects of employee ownership on inequality. And then I open up to discussion. This links to one of Joseph's sort of final points there. I ask my students, if so many of you, and usually it is many of them, would want to work for an employee-owned company, and the research shows that employee ownership is actually good for employees, for firms, and broader societal outcomes, why don't we see more employee-owned companies, right? And so in terms of the class on business and society, this leads to often very interesting discussions about, what are the common critiques of employee ownership, and I try to, draw that out of them, and then, sort of have a discussion with them about what the research and what the experience shows. So a lot of students say, well, it sounds too utopian. It's only feasible for really small companies. And I try to show, for example, how the experience and research shows that's not the case. And here are some other sort of common critiques that we will sort of talk about. And then we also talk about, what are some of the barriers to a broader diffusion of employee ownership if it seems like such a great thing. And we talk about a lack of more robust legislation out there, managerial resistance to sharing power, and then cultural beliefs about the proper role of employees and how employees often aren't seen as capable of sort of running a company. And so that's how I kind of open up to the sort of broader discussion. And that's one class I do on employees as stakeholders. And then I also bring it into a class I do on corporate governance. And here we talk about the assumptions and consequences of the shareholder value model. And then I use Lynn Stout's really powerful critique in her 2012 book called The Shareholder Value Myth, where she really deconstructs the shareholder value model. And that really challenges students, but then it opens up a conversation about what are some alternatives. And so I talk about employee ownership and B Corps as alternatives, focusing on worker cooperatives, because worker cooperatives are the mode that requires the most robust role for employees to be involved in governance. And so I have some video clips here. These are 3. The first 2 here are a few great videos that have some really good clips about some worker co-ops out there. So these are really good videos to show in the classroom. And then I also bring back the example of New Belgium because it was sold last year. And there was a really good forum. And I think Joseph wrote a piece for this, and some other leading thinkers wrote pieces for this forum by a group called 50 by 50, talking about the end of employee ownership at New Belgium. But interestingly, they maintained their B Corp status, even though they were bought bought by Kieran, which is a large sort of multinational corporation. So, and that opens up for general discussion about, how can workers be involved in governance. So that's what I do in terms of this class on business society. And then just very briefly, I want to just touch on the other class that I do that's more organizational behavior class. Analyzing human behavior in organizations using psychology, sociology, anthropology. And this is very much a case-based class where we have a lot of case-based discussions about real organizations and problems they're sort of having and how you try to solve problems around coordination mostly. And we use 3 analytical lenses here to understand organizations: the strategic design lens, how do you structure an organization; the political lens, seeing an organization as a political arena; and then finally a cultural lens, viewing organizations as sort of cultural systems. And those are very sort of powerful ways for students to start to analyze organizations, and they really link into some of the themes around employee ownership. We also talk about organizational change, team building, and leadership in this class. But I usually do an entire class session towards the end of the class about using employee ownership to build high-performing organizations. And here I do an overview like I did in the other class that I won't go into again here about what are the common forms, what does the research show. But I really try to focus in this class on employee ownership and worker empowerment, because all the research shows that employee ownership really has the most significant effects when companies combine it with employee involvement, with business literacy training, with shared financial information. And that really connects us to some of the key topics for this class on OB around incentives and motivation, around collaboration and teamwork, around organizational change and sort of change in organizational culture. And some of the ESOP examples I talked about before, or I'm sorry, just sort of all the examples I talked about before are also good ones to use in this class. But I really try to bring it to life for students as I try to bring in local guest speakers from local companies. And usually it's ESOP companies, but I've also had worker co-ops come in, where speakers will come in and talk about the company background, how they created the employee ownership, and what kind of change efforts they've been involved with to try to build sort of cultures of ownership and the challenges they faced. So most recently I had representatives come in from Harpoon Brewery and Web Industries, which are 2 local Boston ESOP companies. And the good news is that for all of you out there, pretty much most communities or fairly close to you are going to have examples of employee-owned companies. And students just love having these company reps coming in. So I bring them in and they do their little presentations, but this class is very participative. And so what I have each company representative do is bring in a challenge they're facing within their company relating to employee ownership, preferably, but it doesn't have to be, or around organizational change. Then I break my students into teams and have them brainstorm ideas to these challenges and have them report out, right? And that gives them a real deep sense for how, employee participation can happen. And often, these companies get really good ideas. So for example, last time, one of my company representatives brought in the challenge that they have a lot of younger employees coming on board. How do we, and he was struggling with how do we get them excited about the ESOP, because it's a retirement plan. It's usually a very far off sort of abstract benefit for younger employees. And, my students had a lot of good ideas for them in terms of how they could address this. So, okay, just to close out here. Those are 2 examples of how I bring employee ownership into 2 required MBA courses. And it connects to a lot of core themes around OB, around HRM, around business, society, and ethics. And you can also bring it into classes on finance, strategy, and marketing. There are relevant topics there. I don't teach any of those classes, but you can bring them in. And, you can bring them in as just, one part of one class session. You could bring it as an entire class session, or you could have a whole block of classes about this, or you can build an entire course on here. So I encourage you to go to Clio and sort of find some examples of that, of syllabi. There's a lot of good sources there about fundamentals, about the research, and some good cases. But again, student knowledge is usually low, but interest is usually very high. So I definitely, if you're thinking about doing this, I definitely encourage you to do it. And I'm happy to share any of my course materials. Just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to do that. So, and here are my references, and I assume these will be uploaded. So thanks for your time, and I look forward to seeing what my other presenters have to say.
Thank you hugely, Ed Carberry. That was amazing. Next, we have Dr. Daphne Berry.
Yes, just a minute. Hi, I'm Daphne Berry. Can everyone see my slide there? Okay, all right, great. And as Adria mentioned, I teach in the management department. I teach management at the University of Hartford. My background, my training, my school training was in engineering, and I worked as an engineer for a long time, and then I became a manager and worked as a manager for some years and went back to business school. And so that's kind of the source of my interest in management, in work organizations, and also shared ownership. So, all right, so why do I teach employee ownership in my courses? I teach general management courses and also courses on social enterprise and corporate social responsibility. But I like introducing students to different ways of thinking about business and management and organizing and how to affect change where they see changes needed. And as Ed mentioned, most of my students know very, very little about employee ownership, and I hope to change that. And so in the management organizational behavior course that I teach is an undergraduate course. And so the main focus of that course is, other types of things related to decision making and making good choices as managers. But then the social enterprise course is a new course. It's my course that I developed, and I've taught that several times to undergraduates and one or two to graduate students. And it's a bit different course to graduate students. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then for the past 4 years, I've taught a short course where we go for 10 days to northern Spain. And I've taken mostly undergrads, but some master's students. And there we get to see different kinds of businesses that participate in employee ownership, shared ownership. Okay, so first, I do some introduction to employee ownership for the students. So I'll start with my undergraduate management organizational behavior courses. We spend a good bit of time talking about the main focus of the course, decision making and organizations and motivation and the kinds of things we talk about in the course. And then we learn a little bit about employee ownership and go back and talk about how things might be different in an employee-owned business. So we start with a little history and talk about forms of employee ownership. And Blasi, Freeman, and Cruz's book is great for teaching students a little bit of history on employee ownership, employee stock ownership plans. We talk about bonuses and profit sharing. And then we talk about worker cooperatives in general, and then worker cooperatives. And students learn that they know a little bit about consumer cooperatives, and sometimes their parents are members of consumer cooperatives, or even they are. And then we talk about employee stock ownership plans, and we talk about some of the businesses that are employee stock ownership plan companies. And a few students will know a little bit about those because they might have had a parent that worked at them. And then we relate employee ownership to different course topics. So for the management and organizational behavior course, we start out with management history, and the factories and why managers are there and what they do, and generally what the conventional wisdom is about what managers should do, and the relationship of owners to managers and owners to workers. And we talk about their own experiences. We spend a day or so talking about their own experiences as workers and sometimes as managers, and where they learned from and what mattered to them and what was memorable. And so that discussion generates a lot of interest in students and what was memorable in their own work experiences and what they felt and saw and wouldn't want to happen again. So what is a good manager? And we talk about organizational structure and departments and people and who makes what decisions and why is that important? And then we talk about employee ownership. How might this be different if the workers owned shares, or if the workers had input into decision-making about what was going on at work? Might things have been different? Might things have been different in the jobs that you remembered, in the way managers thought of the workers and the workers thought of the managers? So we talk about that a lot. So I work employee ownership in as we talk about the different topics that would happen in, in environments and jobs. And we can talk about that related to family businesses. Some of the students, they do projects that are related to management, and they might want to do one on leadership or family businesses or shared decision making or organizational culture. And again, I use some case studies, and I use the business press and clips for organizations that are famous for their cultures, like Southwest or Zappos. And then we talk about ownership culture and employee ownership. And so with the OB class, the employee ownership part of it is probably 15 or 20% of what they learn, but we do that by integrating employee ownership in with the other topics. And here's an example. So we might talk about organizational design in the management class, and we talk about tall and flat organizations, and what does the organization look like for a manager that's a third level up and they have 50 people under them, and they have 8 managers versus one who might have 2 or 3 team leads, and those 50 people are almost direct reports. What would be different? What would necessarily have to be different? And we talk about who might be making the decisions there, and what their skills might be, and how much autonomy is there, and what kind of environment that might work well in, and would you like that? And so we talk about employee-owned organizations like a worker cooperative, where there's democratic participation in decision-making. And then we talk about ESOPs also, because many ESOP organizations are participatory to some level in terms of decision-making. And then we talk about communication. How would communication vary in a tall organization from the person at the top to the one at the bottom versus one that was much flatter? And how would that matter day to day to that manager or to the people that are doing the work? And for my social enterprises courses, then we talk about what is a social enterprise? What does that mean? What does enterprise mean? What is a social enterprise? And that includes environmental focus too. And why do we need them? Or do we need them? Is this something that we have already and people don't know about it? Or, what is the focus of business? What is the reason behind business? And what should business do? And then we look at a lot of specific features and real life examples of some businesses that call themselves social enterprises, and then businesses that might not use that term, but they are also focused on their stakeholders, obviously, and they're known for focusing on their stakeholders. And then we look at some businesses that we know are focused on their stakeholders because they say so, like Eileen Fisher and Patagonia, King Arthur Flour. And so we do lots of case studies in the social enterprise class, and I use Harvard and Darden, and wherever I can get case studies, some strictly social enterprise, some ESOPs, and some companies that may not be, they might have some problem and don't, or neither. And we look at what they're doing and what we like about what they're doing, and whether this social enterprise is something that we've always had, and now for some reason there's a need to call out the fact that they're a social enterprise, or whether we need a new form of organization and it needs to be something that's legally supported, and why and how, and that type of thing. And then the other course that I teach is a spring break short course in Spain. And it's 10 days, and we do about 2.5 days of just kind of a little vacationing, and the other time we spend visiting companies, and the students really like this. So the businesses in northern Spain, many of them are worker cooperatives. We go to see the Mondragon cooperatives, and we see agricultural cooperatives. We see sustainable businesses that are not cooperatives, because there are lots of them there. And we look at the history of the Basque people that live there, to try to talk about why might they have developed businesses like that, and how do they keep them running, and what's their culture, and what are their languages. And so we do that before the students go, and once they get there, then they can talk to the people there about why and how do you keep this running, and how do you, what's the pay like, and decision-making. My students often say, how could they get anything done if everybody participates in decision-making? So they'll ask the people there at the cooperatives and the other businesses, how does this really work? And they get to hear from them, or why do you work for less money than you might get in some other kind of business? And so it's great for them to hear the people who are working there, to hear their views on it. Sometimes they'll say, well, I do it because, or sometimes they'll say, well, it's really not less if you think about that I have these things taken care of and you have to pay for that yourself. Things like that. And we visit the governments, and we have visited research institutions and talk about their green city initiatives in Vitoria-Gasteiz, in a nearby city to Mondragon. And so that course is really one where we can focus solely on employee ownership, worker cooperatives, and that's a great one. So I like that course. My students like it. And I want to talk a little bit about the undergraduate and graduate level students when we're talking about the social enterprises and these types of different businesses. And what we talk about more for the master's students is we focus on whether a separate legal form of organization is really needed. And that's where we can bring in the employee ownership, because if you're on one side, you can say, well, no, not really. We have these ESOPs and they're there, there are thousands there, and they're doing well. And there's a good bit of overlap between what ESOPs are doing in terms of their stakeholders. They make their profit, they focus on the profit, and they're sharing the wealth, and they care about their communities, and they care about the environment. And maybe we don't need a separate legal form of organization, or what does being separate give them? What kind of support do they get the government? What's the government's role in this? And then we talk about the what should businesses do and be anyway? You know, what do businesses owe back to society, and how involved should CEOs be in that? And so there's lots in the business press, but there are also research papers on that. So the graduate students have the resources to be able to get involved in that. And then we look at corporate social responsibility, and, you know, what's really meaningful and what's really not, and what's a sales pitch, and, you know, how companies can show that they really care about things other than this just a shareholder profit. And so some of the resources I use, the National Center for Employee Ownership has wonderful resources, and I give my undergraduate students in the management class, they have an extra credit assignment, and probably a little bit more than half of them do that. And so they use a list of best companies to work for as it intersects with employee-owned companies. And so they pick those companies, and then they do research. And I have them find out, do they tell that they're employee-owned? And if they do, what do they say? And what else can you find out about them? What's in the business press about these companies? And would you want to work there, and why? And so then the Clio that Adria has updated and has talked a little bit about, the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership has cases there. The Employee Stock Ownership Plan Association has some information available on ESOPs. The Foundation for Enterprise Development's We the Owners film clip is a wonderful one for students to see all of, in a couple of sessions if you have time, but definitely clips from that. And the USFWC, the Democracy at Work Institute, have great information on what co-ops are and what they're supposed to be and what they do. I've also had, like Ed, visits from memberships of the employee ownership community visit my class. Representatives from Caris Reels in Vermont have visited my class several times. The students love that because they get to ask questions about this. And the former ESOP Association president has visited my class, and students are really interested in asking questions about ESOPs and employee ownership. And then we do the case studies, I mentioned that already, and video clips from Business Press and FED and wherever I can find those. And then here are my references. So these will be uploaded. Just a few of them for you to get some feel for where I get my sources. And again, I also would welcome questions, and there's my email, and I'll share resources or anything that you'd like to see from what I do teaching employee ownership to students. Thank you, Adria. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daphne Berry. So helpful to hear all the different ways that you integrate employee ownership into your different classes and connect the concept to different themes and concepts in different ways. So thank you hugely. Lastly, we have Dr. Joseph Blasi.
So hello again. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I teach about equity participation and profit shares in my different classes. So just by way of giving us a little bit more detail. So I'm an economic sociologist. My home department is the Department of Human Resource Management at Rutgers. I also have a joint appointment in the Labor Studies Department and also in the Rutgers Business School. But my main courses are in human resource management. I find that my students have very conventional views about business, if not tending to be very conservative. They tend to be HR majors. Many of them hope to work in large corporations. So this topic is a bit of a stretch for them. But what makes it interesting, as you see from the results of the National Random Sample of the General Social Survey, is 3 out of every 10 adult workers is likely to have some kind of equity participation plan, and 1 out of every 3 is likely to be in a profit sharing or gain sharing plan. So this introduces some real world situation. So I think before we think about why we would teach, we need to ask ourselves why management scholars might be interested in equity and profit participation. I think in terms of theory, it relates to high performance work systems, to strategic human resource management, which I know Rutgers has been known for. What are the kinds of bundles of management practices for which groups of employees, for companies? Why should we have them? What are their outcomes? Agency theory, I think it's really important reason to look into equity and profit participation. And then the resource-based view of the firm-specific human capital is so important, and how do you keep it in the firm? Efficiency wage theory, why might you want to provide shares in a firm, even if it's a bit more generous than other firms? Expectancy theory, the motivation of behavior is determined by how desired is the outcome. Shares may be one of those outcomes. Psychological ownership theory, popularized by Professor John Pierce at the University of Minnesota. And compensation theory, where I think it's really interesting to look at the incentive effects of shares and also the sorting effects. Do they have different outcomes for different groups of workers? And also very, very common in the literature, the free rider problem. The employees who have shares basically have a lot of free riders. How do they monitor each other? What's the proper combination of short and long-term incentives? These are all very interesting questions brought up by all these theories. Another reason why management scholars might be interested has to do with empirical study. Management scholars like to study variables in the workplace, and students are interested in how to manage certain outcomes such as turnover, discretionary effort. I remember when I was at Harvard, John Dunlap, who later became Secretary of Labor, he was in the economics department. He told me in the 70s, he said he thought that 50% of discretionary effort was being held back by employees and firms because they didn't really share in the upside of what they would do. Innovative ideas, what makes workers want to produce new suggestions, innovative ideas, problem-solving behavior and employee involvement systems. Do employees require shares to participate in such things in high-performance work systems? And then policy. We are witnessing, as we all know, the decline of the fixed wage system, and what might replace it? Are shares part of the replacement? It's a big question. My colleague Doug Cruz and I actually designed the profit sharing tax incentive for presidential candidate Hillary Rodham Clinton, and very much inspired by our research. Economic inequality. 74% of wealth, of capital ownership, and 96% of capital income are in the top 10% of families. Do capital shares of profits and shares of equity, play a role in thinking about this? I'm going to go through these next 4 slides really quickly, and really they're just here as resources. There's several major research projects which we've done, which inform our research with really I think interesting empirical work and papers. We've done work on the General Social Survey, where we've designed questions for the General Social Survey over 5 national random samples. And we talk a lot about that in our book, The Citizen Share. So Doug Cruz and Richard Freeman and I wrote The Citizen Share really as a textbook on employee ownership. It's published by Yale University Press, and it's available in Kindle and at Yale and on online booksellers. And we wrote it to be a course, a textbook. Then the NBER, National Bureau for Economic Research, shared capitalism project, where we studied 40,000 workers in 14 firms with kind of a deep dive. This led to a whole series of working papers and an empirical book called Shared Capitalism at Work. Ed played a very important role in this project, as did Adria Scharf. And this is a lot of material for courses. And then our study of the data set uses the basis for the 100 best companies to work for in America, using data from the Great Place to Work Institute that Ed Carberry had a very important role in putting together. And again, there's an important paper by Ed Carberry, Carberry and Myers in diversity and inclusion, and Richard Freeman, Doug Cruz, and I have a paper in the British Journal of Industrial Relations. But these slides are here, they'll be shared with you, and happy to share any of these materials. I think there's a major role for qualitative research in this area, because the principal way that students and policymakers and managers hear about these ideas are through their classes and textbooks and such. And if you're looking for one case textbook to use in a case-oriented class, I think Shared Entrepreneurship by Frank Schipper is really the one. A number of his cases are available on the curriculum library for employee ownership. So following Ed's approach, the view from 3 courses and the curriculum library for employee ownership is really my go-to source. My approach really isn't so much that I'm teaching about employee ownership, whereas my approach is I want to show you a variety of ways that businesses organize themselves and talk about some of these big management theories and big management questions. So in this class, which I teach in the spring semester, it's all focused on a case study a week. And the approach is to talk about theory, to talk about some research, and then to have, and really the COVID crisis pushed me in this direction, a Zoom video case from the CEO or the top manager of a company for an hour, and then that person leaves, and then we have a class discussion about the theory, the research, and what's going on in this company. This last semester, we've had a number of cases, but I'm going to talk about some of them that I use. The high-tech company case of SAIC that's available on Clio, the SRC Holdings case, which is a case on open book management, an ESOP case, also available on Clio, the professional services company, KCI Technologies, they have an interesting ESOP case, and a case of a union ESOP, NBC Ventures in Baltimore. I've also this semester developed a module looking at low-wage jobs and job quality, something that Adria is going to be doing a lot of work on under a Ford Foundation grant over the next year, among supermarket workers who are obviously very much considered to be low paid and have poor job quality. And we look at Homeland Stores, which is an employee-owned supermarket chain in the Midwest based in Oklahoma. And I'm happy to share my retail supermarket lesson plan. In this class this semester, we also had video visits from Gilead Sciences and Moderna, the two firms, as you know from the press. Gilead creating remdesivir, Moderna creating this vaccine that's being talked about. And we had them do Zoom cases in our class to talk about their equity compensation plans. These companies have very deep, very broad-based, and very wealth-enhancing equity compensation plans. We've also had video cases from the former CEO of King Arthur Flour, a well-known consumer brand, and Amstead Industries in Chicago. My other course is the corporate governance course. I talk about equity and profit participation for broad-based groups of workers as a part of my executive compensation lecture. I give a lecture on the history of equity and profit shares in the history of the corporation as it developed, and relate this to principal agent theory in the first lecture on the theory of corporate governance, on principal agent theory, and how shares, if you look at the history of developing the corporate and the company idea, equity and profit shares were a really very important part of that history. I talk about the history of equity and profit sharing in the United States using chapter 4 of our book, The Citizen's Share, which takes one from the revolution up to the present. And then as Ed does, and as Daphne does, I use Marianne Beister's wonderful film, We the Owners, and there's a link to that on Clio. Finally, occasionally I will teach a graduate or undergraduate research seminar, and this is very much focused on reading empirical research, understanding it, and asking what do we learn about how employees function in firms, how managers design efficient systems to engage employees, and we look at these various studies that we just talked about. What I want to specifically emphasize, because it relates to the current very important national debate and concern with the racial wealth gap, is our new study done with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and Rutgers, a team of about 21 researchers that Daphne Berry participated in, and a lot of researchers from the Institute. And that study, Modest Income Workers and Employee Share Ownership, is available on the internet. We ask in this class, what conditions support or detract from employee and company outcomes with different sets of HR practices and supporting bundles, and what role can equity and profit shares play in this? So those are the 3 classes that I've done, and I'm also happy to share material. I have a PDF of most of the research materials and some of the books that I use in the research heavy classes. So delightful to be with you today and visit with you and my colleagues, and thank you very much.
Adria, you're on mute.
Friends, we can all unmute ourselves now. The rest of you have probably already unmuted yourselves. Our plan now is to have just a few minutes of back and forth or questions for one another. Thank you so much, all of you, for your comments. I have a question for somebody. So this is a question sort of directed at Daphne first, but really for any of you, which is, Daphne, I know that you have authored case studies on Karis Reels, if I'm remembering that correctly,
Yes.
and used case studies in your own classes. And I know a few months ago, you and I talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious to ask Daphne and all of you just sort of like what makes a really good teaching case study of an employee-owned company, and or what are a few of your favorite case studies that you use and that you have found helpful? So either what are the features of a good case study, and what are a couple actual examples?
Well, for my management class, one that's focused on almost any management topic. And if it's a really long one, like maybe 30 pages, then often those are kind of for graduate students. They look that way, and they might hit finance and management. They might hit several areas. And so the shorter ones are a little better for me, 10 to 15 pages, because it'll be on something that I can hit in an undergraduate management class. But then also, if it talks about employee ownership or at all, then it's a wonderful one for me, because it often, and so there's really not very many of those. And that's why I wrote my own case study after doing research with Karis Reels and knowing the people there. So I wrote one hoping that other people could use it. And that was really on governance and participation by the ESOP owners in governing the organization, which Karis Reels, but also other ESOPs participate in. So I would say one, if it's depending on whether it's undergraduate or graduate course and the focus, but you can often get other cases and kind of tailor them to what you want, because I do what Ed does, and I have my students, we gather other information, because sometimes the cases are old also. So we go and see what happened after that. What are they doing now? Were they bought out, or what can we learn about what was going on in that case? So also, if I write a teaching assistance for, say, a management professor, that might help a management professor, but it might not help a professor in another area quite as much. So, but as much as you can put there in the teaching part of the assignment, it would be great, to help teachers with that. I don't know, Ed, anything else, Ed or Joseph?
I think I agree with everything you say, and most of mine are with my MBA students, and so the best cases really are well written, and that really bring out a couple of core discussion points that students can really sink their teeth into and have debate about, and that connect to some theory, whether you're talking about governance or employee involvement or leadership is another sort of common one. There's one on King Arthur that's available through Harvard. That's
yeah,
as well. And the other thing for me is when I'm looking for cases, probably all of you out there too, is the ones that have really good teaching notes are actually really helpful. It helps me do my work, and I usually adapt those a little bit, but I usually look for cases that have really good teaching notes that really link up with my style of teaching. And what I also do, and I found this to be very effective when I first started teaching at UMass Boston, we'd be talking about a case, and I don't do a lot of lecturing. I try to have a lot of participation. And I saw students reading the case as we were trying to talk about it, realizing they didn't really prepare the case. So what I instituted the next semester was they have to write a 2-page case briefing for every case. And it's pass or fail, and I don't grade them on grammar or anything like that. I just give it a skim to see, okay, did they actually make a good faith effort to read the case and answer the questions I give them? And it fundamentally transformed the class discussion.
Yeah.
Everybody came prepared, and it's pass fail, so it's an easy way for people to pad their grade. But it really was, it's really one of the best teaching things. I'm sure a lot of you out there do that, but I think that's worth emphasizing broadly.
That's a good thought.
So I'll weigh in on that. I used to think before the pandemic that the best case had a really good story and also gave some very detailed data about how much the shares added up to, the history of the company, how it got there, the impact on the wealth of the different classes of employees, and especially how employee involvement and governance happened. But I've completely changed my mind now, because I was forced, as all of us were, to take my class online. And so since it was a case study class, I found myself calling these CEOs and doing these 1-hour Zoom calls with them. And I found that the live Zoom cases just fascinated the students. And it was just really easy to get people who normally I couldn't get to come to my physical class to give an hour. They felt like they were a Hollywood star to be talking to a group of students, and they would tell their employees that they were visiting with a management class that day. So it was kind of a win-win situation. And I found that what happened in these video cases is that we came to the same place of the really good written cases, which is the manager would tell a really good story, and then students and I would zoom in on these key questions. So I very much encourage you, Adria, to create some of these management video cases for us to use. I think they're as easy as recording this session here, and I think they will have a lot of staying power.
So Joseph, how was the case set up? How is a problem? Who, does the executive comes to the table with something they want to talk about, or how, do you kind of guide that?
I would give the executive 4 or 5 questions, similar to how I've summarized the best case, and ask them to go over these questions for about a half an hour description. And then I would ask questions to make sure to fill in any details that they didn't cover. And then we'd open it to discussion for about a half an hour to another hour. So usually it ended up being a 60 to 90 minute live video case. But it just really transformed the student experience. And now with the technology that we have, I'm not sure I like paper cases anymore.
Wow.
Okay. Good, thank you.
It's a new day. Friends, any other questions for one another or final reflections?
I had one question, another question for Joseph and for Ed too, also about, you said the students often would come to your course feeling kind of like this wasn't the place for them to be with their HR interest. And so what about at the end of the course? Do you feel that they're more open to learning about this as something that, might be useful to them in their work lives or research or whatever? How did that end? Usually?
Well, I'll say that, when I was a young lecturer in social studies at Harvard, I was hoping to interest my students in equity, participation, and profit shares. And my approach now is to give them a very big tent tour of the business world and how these things pop up. It might be a company like Gilead, which has a lot of broad-based equity participation, but is owned by investors, and open it up to a lot of discussion, a lot of theory, a lot of research. I find that at the end of that kind of class, more students develop a serious interest in these ideas, but they pick and choose. Some students decide, well, profit sharing seems to make more sense. Some students decide on various other of these practices, and some students come away with the variety of lessons learned. So I think it's a better method, rather than saying I'm teaching about employee ownership, to just teach about a variety of ways that shares manifest themselves in the modern business world.
Yeah, I think I had a similar experience where, especially in my OB class, one of the exercises I do is have people just brainstorm qualities of a good job and qualities of a bad job. I write them all out, and then so most people know what it's like to have a good job, and they all want good jobs, right? And often the best employee-owned companies sort of encapsulate a lot of those things, but not, it doesn't employee-owned. So that's a useful thing. And what I find, I find similar to Joseph, that most of my MBA students are, I have a few quote unquote lefties in the room, but most of them have fairly conventional views of things. And I don't see my role as trying to persuade them in any one direction, but again, to give them the information and have them decide for what it is. But what I do find is that a lot of students they're not necessarily converted to this is an amazing thing afterwards, but they know a lot more about it, and they can make up their own minds about it. But I find that a lot of students are very interested, and I sort of do as Joseph. I try to bring it in to different parts of my class to see where it's sort of relevant as an alternative to systems that aren't working quite as well, whether it be workplace relationships or the shareholder value model, right? And that's one of the hardest things, because what I find is a lot of the conventionally minded students, they really believe the shareholder value model. Like they really believe that investors are the ones that deserve the rights to governance, right? And they really believe that. And that's a really hard thing to challenge, and I don't say, well, you need to believe this, but I try to say, well, why is it that way? How come employees aren't on the same place in terms of governance? And I think that leads to some really interesting discussions, but that's a real challenge, I think. So,
yeah.
Nice.
I will add just very briefly. I'm sorry, Daphne, were you going to?
No, nothing. Go ahead.
I would just add very briefly that this generation believes that they deserve a share of that productivity. And even though they have very conventional, I would say conservative views about the business world, personally, they think that I deserve a share.
Right.
And that's sort of the way that this class interests them.
Interesting. I'm curious whether any of you know of any students you've had in any of your courses that have been exposed to some of these ideas, who have then gone on to either start a business or lead a business or work in the private sector, and have translated any of these ideas, or Daphne maybe translated their learning about Mondragon on their spring trip with you into the real economy.
I had one group of students come back the next year. They graduated, and four of the young men said they were going to start a business where they were equal owners and they were have a sustainable product. They were very excited, and they came back and talked to me about that several times. So that was good to hear. And I've had a couple of students get started and be interviewing and pick ESOP companies, and have the people they were talking with be surprised that they knew what it was. And so just a couple, but that's rewarding.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I've had any students, but every time I have the company representatives come in, I have a lot of students go up to them and ask if they're hiring.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, I would just say that, yes, a lot of students are interested in using these case studies, the live case studies, the video case studies to get jobs. The thing that happens to me most often is students will come after class and say, okay, I just got an offer from this company. Help me figure out what profit gain or equity shares I'm getting and what they're going to be worth and if it's fair. And again, this generation is very goal oriented.
Yeah.
Very true. Friends, thank you hugely for this.
Thank you, Adria.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Adria.
This concludes our workshop. I want to again thank my colleagues so much for sharing their wisdom and experience with all of us today. And I want to just make a final reminder and encouragement to visit the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership, clio.rutgers.edu, where you can find 600 different resources, including many case studies that are free and fully downloadable from the site to use as you explore the possibility of integrating employee ownership into your own teaching. With that, thank you so much once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.